phone rang at 3:07 a.m., the exact minute my little brother died a week before. And when I answered, his voice whispered that something in our childhood home had never let him leave. Jared had spent most of his 20s trying to outrun his past. The world outside Shelbyville, Indiana seemed big enough to absorb his guilt. Endless highways lined with diners, gas stations, and neon-lit motels where he could pretend he belonged anywhere but home. Yet when his mother called, crying, the smell of overcooked bacon faint in the background of the phone line, the miles between them collapsed. His little brother, Mason, had been found in the attic of their old farmhouse, lifeless on the wooden planks where they used to build forts as kids. Mason had always been the fearless one. At 10 years old, he could climb the rusted grain silo by the cornfield, while Jared waited below, feet planted on prairie grass, fingers twitching with a mixture of admiration and worry. Mason would shout, "Watch me fly!" before leaping off into a haystack. Jared's anxiety always diffused into laughter when his brother popped up unscathed, straw stuck in his hair like a crown. Those memories warmed Jared on the drive back to Shelbyville, but a chill crept into him as he pulled up the long gravel driveway. The white two-story farmhouse looked the same: peeling paint, sagging porch, a tire swing rocking gently in the March wind. Everything felt frozen in time. Yet the police report said Mason hadn't fallen. There was no ladder out of place, no broken bones. He had simply been found lying on the floorboards, eyes wide open, heart quieted. The funeral was small. A cluster of cousins in their Sunday best murmured condolences under the dim lights of St. Paul's Chapel. Jared stood beside his mother, her fingers digging crescents into his palm. When Pastor Rick opened his Bible and spoke of mysterious ways and divine plans, Jared stared at Mason's closed casket and felt a hollow understanding settle. No plan could make sense of his brother's sudden absence. After the reception, Jared tried to talk to friends he hadn't seen since high school. Shelbyville was the sort of place where people asked if you were still doing that city thing. He nodded, mumbled something about freelance design and Los Angeles, and deflected their thinly veiled questions about when he'd settle down. It was easier than explaining why he'd never answered Mason's last call. Years earlier, when Jared first left for college, the calls came frequently. Mason asking advice about girls, skate tricks, and whether you could microwave pizza rolls in tinfoil. Jared answered every time. But eventually he grew busy, and their conversations shrank to texts and sporadic holiday visits. Then one night, Mason called past midnight. Jared saw the name flash and swiped it away, promising himself he'd call back in the morning. He never did. In the days after the funeral, strange things began to happen. Jared stayed at his mother's house to help her sort through Mason's belongings. It was therapeutic at first, folding shirts with faded high school logos, boxing up comic books and old PlayStation games. The attic seemed like the obvious place to start. It smelled like dry wood and dust. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. Cobwebs clung to the slanted beams. Jared braced himself for a wave of sadness. Instead, he felt watched. When he opened a box labeled "Trophies," the topmost participation ribbon fluttered to the ground. He reached to pick it up and heard something scrape behind him. He spun around. Nothing. The tiny rectangular window at the far end framed a slice of gray sky. He rubbed his arms and forced a laugh. It was an attic. No one liked attics. But the scraping happened again that night. A long, low drag, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Jared sat up in bed, the digital clock glaring 3:07 a.m. His heart hammered against his ribs. He listened. Wind whistled under the eaves. The refrigerator hummed. He told himself he was just grieving. He tried to sleep again. The next morning, his mother told him she had dreamt of Mason. "He was standing at the foot of my bed," she whispered over coffee, eyes red. "He told me he didn't mean to go in the attic." She shook her head. Why would he say that? He used to spend hours up there playing. Jared forced a smile and said dreams could be weird. Internally, he added a note of terror. At exactly 3:07 a.m., he had heard something. At 3:07 a.m., Mason had died. Now his mother was seeing Mason in dreams. Maybe their minds were just finding patterns to soothe their grief. Or maybe something in the house had been woken up.
That afternoon, Jared found Mason's old cell phone in a desk drawer, its cracked case covered in stickers. Surprisingly, it had enough battery to power on. Jared sat on the couch and scrolled. There were photos of skate parks, friends making goofy faces, and one picture of Jared from Christmas 2 years ago, half asleep with a Santa hat. Then he noticed an app he didn't recognize. It was labeled Shelbyville Historical Society. Curious, he tapped it. It wasn't an app. It was a recording. The first 30 seconds were static. Then a voice, Mason's. "Is anyone else up here?" Jared froze. He hadn't known Mason had been recording anything. He turned up the volume. Mason's voice continued, as if he didn't want to be overheard. "Okay, so this is the attic. Mom freaks out when I come up here, so I'm documenting for science," he said, with a hint of playful bravado. "Ever since Dad's old radio turned itself on last week, I keep hearing noises like scratches. Maybe raccoons? I'm gonna prove it so Jared believes me." Jared's throat closed. He hadn't received this recording. How had Mason intended to send it? He listened. The audio hissed, then picked up a faint tapping. "Hear that?" Mason whispered. "It's coming from the wall." A few seconds later, he said, "Okay, that was weird. The wallpaper just moved." Mason laughed nervously. "Seriously, I think something's—" The recording stopped. Jared replayed it, hoping to catch some rational explanation in the background. On the second listen, just before the end, he heard a sound he'd missed. A low, guttural whisper overlapping Mason's voice. It sounded like a word drawn out by a breeze. "Stay." He stood, phone clutched tightly, and marched to the attic. The afternoon light slanted through the small window, casting dust motes in golden beams. Jared crouched and examined the wallpapered wall Mason had mentioned. It was the one facing north, near an old trunk. The wallpaper pattern, a faded floral print, was peeling slightly in the corner. He tugged at it. It tore away easily, revealing wood. Cedar darkened with age. He'd expected drywall. Strange. When their parents moved in decades earlier, Jared assumed the attic had been modernized. Beneath the wallpaper, instead of insulation, there was thick timber. As he knocked lightly, the sound was less of a hollow thud and more of a solid reverberation. He pressed his ear against it. For a second, he thought he heard movement beyond the wall, like something shifting lazily. He jerked back. "Jared?" his mother called from downstairs. "You okay up there?" "Yeah," he shouted, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. He couldn't tell her he might have just discovered a secret space behind the wall. He didn't want to worry her. Instead, he measured the area with his eyes. The wall with the wallpaper measured about 8 feet long. If there was a hidden room, it wasn't huge. He considered whether to go to the hardware store for a crowbar. The idea of ripping apart their house while his mother still grieved seemed reckless. That evening,
As he served leftover casserole, he asked his mother if she knew anything about the attic. She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "Your father sealed off part of it when we first moved in," she said slowly. "He said the previous owners had a leaky roof and that it was rotten. He didn't want us kids getting in there." "Did he ever fix it?" Jared asked. She shook her head. "Your father was a lot of things, but handy wasn't one of them. He just covered it up and promised he'd hire someone. Then time passed and we forgot."
Jared chewed his casserole, the flavors of canned mushroom soup and processed cheddar blending with a metallic tang of dread. Why cover up a rotten section with wallpaper? Why not boards? Unless you didn't want anyone to know it existed. He didn't sleep that night, again watching the digits of the clock flicker toward 3:07. He rolled over and faced the wall when he should have left the house. At 3:06, the air in his room grew cold. It wasn't the gentle cool of a draft, but the raw chill of an open freezer. He could see his breath in the faint light from the street lamp. Then the scraping began. This time, it wasn't muffled. It was in the hallway. A dragging sound, like bare feet shuffling on hardwood. He lay frozen, eyes fixed on the shadow under his door. For a brief second, he saw a darker shape pass by. He bolted upright and flung open the door. The hallway was empty. The darkness seemed thicker. He flicked on the light, expecting to catch his mother sleepwalking. Instead, he saw wet footprints leading toward the attic stairs. They were small, like Mason's used to be at 10 years old. The edges glistened as if whatever left them had come from a stream. But there was no water in the house. "Mom?" he called, voice tight. No answer. He followed the footprints, heart pounding. They disappeared at the base of the attic ladder. He stared up into the darkness and felt a pressure, like a hand on his chest, pushing him to climb. He didn't want to. Every rational part of his brain screamed to wait until morning, call someone, bring a flashlight. But he kept seeing his mother at the table that morning, eyes rimmed red, telling him about her dream. He had failed Mason once before. He couldn't fail again. He climbed. The attic was silent. The bulb flickered once and steadied. Jared's breath puffed little clouds. He turned, expecting to see nothing but boxes. Instead, the wallpaper on the north wall rippled, as if a breeze passed behind it. He stepped closer. The floral pattern fluttered slightly. Then it bulged, the paper stretching outward like something was pressing from within. A muffled knock reverberated from behind the wall. "Mason?" Jared whispered before he could stop himself. The knock came again, slower. He reached out and pressed his palm against the wallpaper. Something cold met his hand. Not wood, but skin. He yanked his hand back, heart ricocheting in his chest. The imprint of his palm remained on the wallpaper for a beat before fading. He ran. Down the ladder, through the hallway, across the kitchen, and out the back door onto the porch. He leaned against the railing, gulping cold night air. The stars above Shelbyville glittered indifferently. For a while, he listened to the hum of distant highway traffic and the chirp of crickets. When he finally convinced himself to go back inside, he locked the attic door. The next morning, he drove into town to the library. He needed answers. The Shelbyville Public Library was a brick building that had smelled the same since he was a kid, like book glue and history. The librarian, Mrs. Hendricks, recognized him immediately. "Jared Foster, "I heard you were back," she said, squeezing his hands in hers. "I'm so sorry about your brother." He thanked her and asked if he could see any historical records about his parents' house. Mrs. Hendricks's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, you're the Fosters in the McCleary place out on Old Mill Road." She led him to a back room filled with microfiche machines. "We don't get many people asking about that property." They spent an hour scrolling through old newspaper articles projected onto gray screens. He found the listing for the house when his parents had bought it. There was no mention of structural issues. But then, tucked between a farm equipment auction advertisement and a church potluck announcement, was a headline from July 1975. 3 children missing in local farmhouse. Jared held his breath. The article detailed a tragedy at the McCleary farm. The family's 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 10, had disappeared one afternoon while playing hide-and-seek. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle. The mother told authorities she had heard them laughing in the attic one moment and silence the next. Search parties combed the property for days. Eventually, they were declared missing, presumed dead. A haunting quote closed the piece. "Mrs. McCleary says she still hears them playing at night." Jared sat back, stomach roiling. Mrs. Hendricks touched his shoulder. "That house has a reputation," she said softly. "Some folks say it's cursed. That's why it sat empty so long before your parents bought it." "We never knew," he whispered. Mrs. Hendricks nodded. "People thought the rumors died down. But when your father boarded up that section, well, we all assumed he found something he didn't want you kids seeing." Jared thanked her, photocopied the article, and left. Back in his car, he stared at the grainy newspaper photo of the farmhouse. It looked unchanged. A chill traveled down his spine. If 3 children had vanished behind that wall, and Mason had died there decades later, there had to be some connection. The word that Mason's recording captured, stay, looped in his mind. What if something in that hidden room collected children? And what if it wasn't done? That night, he didn't wait for 307. He prepared. He found his father's old toolbox in the garage and dug out a hammer, crowbar, and heavy flashlight. He told his mother he was going to check the insulation in the attic, and she barely nodded, lost in her own fog of grief. He climbed the ladder, closed the attic door behind him, and placed a chair under the knob so nothing could open it from the hallway. He took a deep breath and approached the wallpaper. His hands shook slightly as he slid the crowbar under the edge and pried. The glue gave with a sticky rip. The wallpaper peeled away like dead skin, revealing the dark wood underneath. He tore more, ignoring the prickling on his neck, until a section of cedar planks stood bare. He tapped the wood. It sounded strangely hollow now. He set the crowbar's claw under one board and pulled. The board splintered and gave way. A wave of cold air spilled out. Behind the plank, there was indeed a narrow space about 3 feet wide, running the length of the wall. A void hidden for decades. He shone his flashlight inside. Dust motes swirled. Cobwebs draped corners like curtains. But there was something else. A small wooden door at the far end. Its surface was carved with swirling patterns that made his eyes blur. A simple metal latch kept it closed. He hesitated. If there were answers, they lay behind that door. He crawled into the space, the rough wood catching his sweater. The air grew colder with each foot. When he reached the door, he saw that the carvings were not random patterns, but names. 3 names scratched faintly: Sarah, Benjamin,
Eliza. He swallowed. The missing McCleary children. Beneath them, fresh and jagged, a fourth, Mason. His vision swam. His brother had been here, had carved his own name. Maybe he had left a message. He lifted the latch with trembling fingers. The door swung inward with a sound like a sigh.
Beyond was darkness, dense and thick. His flashlight beam penetrated a few feet, illuminating a set of wooden steps descending into blackness. The air smelled damp, like earth after rain. The space could not physically exist. The house's foundation ended at the attic floor, yet the stairs descended. He thought of all the horror movies where characters make the wrong choice. He could call the police. He could nail the boards back up and pretend he never saw the names. He could leave Shelbyville entirely. But then he remembered Mason's call, unanswered, and the decades-old article with children vanishing. He had to know. He took one step down, then another. The temperature dropped further. His breath clouded. The walls felt close. The beam of his flashlight flickered, and he smacked it. It steadied. As he descended, he thought he heard whispering, faint voices overlapping, like children playing tag in another room. He strained to catch words. Between the murmur, a clear voice rose. "Stay." He clenched his jaw and kept going. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a small room carved into earth. The floor was dirt, worn smooth by countless steps. The walls were packed clay and stone. In the center stood an old radio, the kind his father had kept in the garage, a metal box with a dial and antenna. It crackled with static. Beside it lay toys, a doll missing an eye, a wooden train car, a modern fidget spinner dusted with soil. He recognized the spinner. Mason had always fidgeted. The whispers grew louder, coalescing. Then, from the darkness, shapes emerged. Children. Pale, translucent figures with wide, searching eyes. 3 of them. A girl with braids, a boy with freckles, and another girl clutching a doll. Their clothes were old-fashioned, pinafores and knickerbockers. Behind them, a 4th form hovered, taller, more defined. Mason. Jared dropped the flashlight. It hit the ground and rolled, casting spinning shadows. "Mason," he choked. His brother's ghost looked like him, but paler, his edges blurred. Mason smiled sadly. "You came," Mason whispered. The sound seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. "I tried calling. I needed you to hear." "What is this?" Jared whispered, eyes burning. "It keeps us," Mason said, his voice layered with a hollow resonance. "We were playing, and we found the door. We thought it was a secret club, but once you go down, you can't leave. It likes us to stay." The radio crackled, and a deep, rumbling voice oozed through the static. "Stay." The ground vibrated slightly. The children's faces tightened. Jared felt a pressure around his chest, a force like invisible hands pressing him down. "Fight it!" he shouted, though he didn't know how. He reached toward Mason, but his hand passed through him. It was like moving through ice water. Cold seared his skin. He gasped and withdrew. "You have to break the radio," Mason said quickly. "That's its tether. Dad found it once, but he was too scared to smash it. He just boarded us up." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Jared stammered. "I tried calling you," Mason said, sadness in his flickering eyes. "You were busy." Guilt slammed into Jared. He looked at the radio. It was old, but the metal glinted, uncorroded.
It emanated a low thrum. He grabbed his flashlight and swung at it. The flashlight bounced off with a dull thunk, leaving only a scratch. The room's walls pulsed, and the voice from the radio laughed quietly. "Stay," it crooned, almost affectionately. He gritted his teeth and swung again, this time with the hammer he'd brought. The impact rang like striking an anvil. A thin crack appeared across the radio's side. The whispering intensified, like dozens of voices whispering his name. The pressure around his chest squeezed tighter. His vision spotted. "Harder," Mason urged. The other children's eyes widened, hope flickering. Jared summoned every ounce of strength and rage he had. Anger at himself, at whatever entity had stolen children, at the years of guilt. He thought of Mason jumping from the silo, fearless, trusting him to catch him. He thought of ignored calls and missed birthdays. He swung the hammer down with a scream. The radio shattered. Metal shards flew. A burst of cold wind whipped through the room. The static surged into a high-pitched wail and then cut off. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, like fog burned off by sunlight, the children's figures brightened, their outlines sharpening, before dissolving into sparkles that drifted upward like fireflies. Mason met Jared's eyes and smiled, tears glistening. "Thank you," he mouthed. Then he too dissolved, his form breaking into light that swirled and shot toward the ceiling of the Earth room. Jared watched, breath caught, as the light seeped through cracks and vanished. The pressure around his chest lifted. Warmth returned to the air. The radio lay in pieces, inert and harmless. He sat on the dirt floor, hands shaking, and sobbed. Relief, grief, exhaustion pouring out in tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed. After a time, he forced himself up the stairs, crawling back through the narrow space into the attic. He replaced the boards as best he could and shoved boxes in front of the area. In the kitchen, the digital clock read 4:12 a.m. The sun would rise soon. He sat at the table and stared at his phone, hoping to see a new message from Mason. He knew there wouldn't be one. Instead, he opened a blank text and typed, "I'm sorry," though he had no one to send it to. When his mother woke later, she seemed lighter. She made pancakes for the first time in months. Over breakfast, she said, "I had a dream last night. Mason was standing at the foot of my bed again, but this time he was smiling. He said, 'Tell Jared,' he answered." Her eyes filled with tears, but her mouth curved upward. Jared reached across the table and squeezed her hand. He didn't tell her about the hidden room or the radio. He knew she'd never feel safe in the house otherwise. He decided they'd sell it soon, once she was ready. He would make sure no other family moved in unaware. The day he moved his mother into a new condo in Indianapolis, he returned to the farmhouse one last time. He walked through each room, touching walls. Goodbye. In the attic, he slid a note into the gap between the boards. "If you hear a voice telling you to stay, don't listen. Call someone you trust, and answer when they call." He nailed the boards back firmly and covered them with new drywall. Then he locked the door and left. As he drove down the gravel driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, he thought he saw Mason standing on the porch, hand raised in a half-wave. Jared smiled through tears and kept driving, the house shrinking behind him until it was just another speck in the vast Indiana farmland. Months later, in his Los Angeles apartment, the nightmares eased. Sometimes he still woke at 3:07 a.m., heart racing, ears straining for whispers. But instead of guilt, he felt a quiet strength. He started answering his phone more. He reconnected with friends. He visited his mother on weekends. And every once in a while, when a radio crackled in a coffee shop or a car sped by with static on the stereo, he would think of Mason and the other children and remember that sometimes the most terrifying things can be quiet. A hidden room, a missed call, a whispered plea. And sometimes the scariest part is realizing you could have been the one who kept someone from staying in the dark for good. As Halloween approached and neighbors hung plastic skeletons and fake cobwebs, Jared told his story to friends around the bonfire. Some laughed nervously, assuming he was being dramatic. Others listened wide-eyed. When he recited the hook, the call at 3:07 a.m., the whisper from beyond, even the city kids leaned closer, the flames reflecting in their eyes. And maybe, just maybe, when their phones buzzed late at night with a family member's name, they answered, if only for a few minutes, because deep down, they understood that real horror doesn't just lurk in haunted houses. It lives in regret and the voices we ignore until it's too late.